Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna and K.S. each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 6, in which Johanna and I discuss Norse sorceresses discovered in archaeology. I'm K.S. Barton. I'm the author of the Norse Family Trilogy, a story in which a young Viking daughter of a Jarl and a Viking warrior are caught in a deadly blood feud between two families. My most recent novel is A Deal with Odin, a historical fantasy of love beyond death, in which a Viking woman journeys into the realm of Norse myth. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hi, Kim. I wanted to say I just finished reading A Deal with Odin, and I really enjoyed it. It was great.
Oh, thank you. It was fun to write.
I bet it was. It was highly recommended.
Thank you.
I'm Johanna Wittenberg. I'm the author of the Norse Women series, based on the life of Queen Osa, who was a real Norse queen who ruled alone for 18 years at the dawn of the Viking Age.
And your books are wonderful too. I highly recommend them. So this week we are going to this month, today, this episode, we're going to get into Viking sorceresses that have been discovered in archaeology. So in our previous episode, episode 5, Johanna and I discussed the Volur. Those are human women who performed magic. So we looked at some of the written sources like sagas and poems in which these women were mentioned. Sources like Eric the Red's saga, Svipdagmal, and Hrolf's saga Kraki, and the stories of Gunhild, Mother of Kings, who was mentioned in several different sources. Now we'd like to look at some of the archaeological evidence that these women actually existed. Not that we didn't believe that beforehand, but now we have some concrete proof. So when we combine these written sources and the archaeology, we get a much fuller picture of who they were and whether the stories tell of sorceresses who were revered or despised. These Norse women were definitely a force to be reckoned with.
Yes, they were. The burials that have been found indicate that the Volur were feared, venerated, and held in very high status. The Viking world abounds with burials of women who have the attributes of the Volur. Chief among these are the staffs, which we already discussed to a certain degree. But there are other items that also indicate the profession. There's charms. They're made of silver, bronze, or other metals, and they're very common in women's graves. There's miniature staffs, miniature swords, spearheads, and of course, the charms of the Valkyrie maidens. One very odd charm that appears in women's graves throughout Scandinavia is that of a miniature chair. And they're usually round, called a cub chair, which is a chair that's fashioned from a stump. It's just basically the whole round piece of wood is there, and it's got the back carved and the seat carved, and they're highly decorated. So most of them are round, and they have a low curved back. They're decorated with carvings of flowers or other things. And there's also an image of a woman seated in a chair like this on a Gotlandic picture stone. So only one chair charm has been found that is square with a curving back. And this resembles the Oseberg chair. In other words, the chair that was found in the Oseberg burial. It's the only Viking chair that has ever been found intact.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. And it was square, just like this one charm. And it was built of posts, 4 posts and boards. And it has a curved back. The sides of the seat were perforated as if the seat were latticed with some kind of cord or rope. And I'm sure there was a cushion placed on the seat. And it seems reminiscent of Thorbjorg's feather cushion in Eric the Red's saga. The back of this chair was painted, and the remains of a a image of a gripping beast that looked kind of like a dragon has been sketched on it. There were sketches of it when it was first found. The question is, could this have been a high seat or a chair of prophecy? Another place where we find this chair is in the Lewis chessmen, which were carved much later, but it shows kings, queens, and bishops, and they're seated on chairs that are very much like the Oseberg chair. So it's suggesting that maybe this was a throne of royalty, or at least a very high status individual. Could have been a vulva, could have been a queen, or both. Odin's throne in mythology, Lidskjalf, is the ultimate high seat. And from there, the occupant can look out over the whole world. So, Kim, you can start us off with this burial from Fyrkat, Denmark.
Yeah. Actually, I want to step back for a second. When you mentioned the amulets and of Valkyrie, I actually bought myself a replica of one.
Oh, wonderful.
I'll post a picture on like our Facebook page or something. I'm showing it to Johanna right now.
I love that one. Yeah, that's my favorite one because it's 3-dimensional.
Yeah, and it's the one we use for our logo on our podcast and everything. So if you take a look at our logo, it's the little Valkyrie or Shield Maiden. Nobody's entirely sure if she's a human woman or a Valkyrie. Either way, she's very cute. And even the back of the one I have, she has her long hair and there's work on her dress. So it's very cool. Yeah. So even us modern women like our little pendants. I don't do magic with her though.
Good.
And then I also, when you mentioned Odin's seat and the occupant can look out over the whole world, I know I've mentioned Tolkien before, but there's the seat, I don't remember the name of it. It's Frodo sits on it and he can see like what's going on up in the north and like what the orcs are doing. And that's when he gets the vision of Sauron's eye. He's sitting it's on a raised platform made of stone and there's a high seat on it where he's far seeing. So I'm sure Tolkien must have gotten that.
Elrond's seat or was that I can't remember.
Yeah, it just came to me now. And yeah, I'm going to go look it up too. So
either Elrond or Galadriel. I can't remember which one now.
Yeah, or it could have been like the kings, the old kings, now I can't remember what they're called. I can't remember. The ones that Aragorn is derived from or his ancestors. Anyway. Right. So I'm sure Tolkien got that from Norse mythology because he got so much from Norse mythology. Okay. That was my little side trip. All right. So there's a really interesting burial. It's in Fyrkat, Denmark, it's near a fort. And this burial was discovered in the 1950s, and it was of a high status woman who was buried in about 980, 981. And this is near a ring fortress. And if you look up like a ring fortress in Denmark, you can actually, you can see where the rings go around, like it's all green, but you can see the ring around where it would have been, where the fortress would have been. So this particular woman, she was dressed in blue and red, and her dress was adorned with gold thread. So similar to other medieval societies, the Viking world, only wealthy people wore such colorful clothes in general. And when you add in the gold thread that she had on her dress, it really indicates her high status. So she was laid out in the body of a horse-drawn carriage, like just the wood part of the carriage, but there were no horses with her, at least none that were found, even though there's been other burials where there's been horses buried with the women. And she was buried with several items. Like she had 2 bronze bowls that came from Central Asia. So that's that's a long way. And it's just, I'm really loving all the scholarship that's been going on lately of people studying the Vikings who went east, all the road down through what is now Russia and Ukraine, and all the way down to what is now Istanbul, even into like Persia and stuff coming from all the way from places like India. I mean, it was quite remarkable. she also was, and this, I don't know why this particular thing interested me so much. She was wearing a toe ring.
It's the only mention of toe rings
I've never seen it anywhere else. And I was like, oh, where did she get that? How did she get the idea to wear a toe ring? Where did she get it from? Did she get it? Did somebody give it to her? I'm just
what a story that could be.
I'm so fascinated by this toe ring and this woman who was wearing it. Anyway, I guess that like shows you the mind of a writer, like that one teeny tiny detail. And like all of a sudden a complete story starts to form. Like, what if? So all of these things indicate her high status, the way she was dressed, how she was buried, the items that came from far away. But then there are items that signified that she was a seeress or sorceress or whatever you want to call them. She had a metal staff, as Johanna mentioned, and she also had a small purse that contained henbane seeds. So when thrown into a fire in the right proportions, henbane can produce a hallucinogenic effect. So too much henbane can kill you, but if you get it right, it can be a hallucinogenic. And so women who performed magic, maybe to, go into a trance, see into the future, maybe she was using some kind of hallucinogenic. I think there's even speculation that maybe berserkers were doing that too. And
yes,
that's what put in there, that what gave them their berserk rage, but we don't know.
No,
I'm assuming that's probably what she was using it for. And we do know from Eric the Red saga that Thorbjorg, the vulva, needed a lot of special items to be able to see into the future, and maybe henbane was one of those. So this particular woman was also buried with a small little box that contained owl pellets and small bird and animal bones, which were probably also used for magic. I mean, that seems like a very common thing.
Kind of the Eye of Newt.
Right.
from Macbeth.
Yeah, like Macbeth's witches, she would have her cauldron and throw in, okay, I want 3 owl pellets and the wing bones of this bird. And she also was wearing a belt buckle, and inside of it was white lead. So this was used to maybe paint her face. Maybe she painted her face for some kind of ritual. I don't know what else. Maybe the lead, unless she ate it.
Oh, I hope
and
not.
it made her go into a trance or something. I like to imagine her, painting her face somehow. And then, well, I have this image of her with like the white lead on her face and maybe some kind of elaborate, like a crown, like made out of antlers or something. Her braids done elaborately in her her red and blue clothes. And yeah, it's pretty striking.
Very impressive.
Yes, impressive. Well, in addition to all this witchy stuff, she was also buried with some traditional women's items, a spindle and whorl and scissors. But as we've talked about before, weaving goes hand in hand with magic in the Norse world. So the spindle and whorl and scissors, maybe there was that magic of, maybe cutting someone's fate, or who knows, it's just also interwoven. Pardon my pun. That they could have just been traditional women's things or part of her, magic, or both. So this series of Fyrkat is an example of a high status woman who was buried with an enormous amount of respect and care. And we've seen this before when we did our episode on archaeology. Was that episode 2 or 3?
I think it was 2, but I'm not sure.
2. I think you're right. Much like the women in the Oseberg burial or Birka BJ 581, just a tremendous amount of care went into what they did, how they arranged her, what they buried her with, how they buried her. So she was clearly an important person in her community. And then you add in that the burial is near the Fyrkat Ring Fortress, which was built by Harald Bluetooth, who is a very famous and powerful Danish Viking king from the 10th century. Only a woman very highly regarded would have been buried that close to the fortress. So, and as we discussed with BJ 581, she was buried near a fort as well.
Perhaps partly for protection.
Yeah. So this was an example, kind of like in Eric the Red saga of a woman who was magic, who was very well respected and revered. But then we get to another place in Denmark, Gerdrup, where there's a very different burial. So in this one, the woman was not revered. She was despised and or feared. This particular burial was excavated in 1981 in Gerdrup, Denmark. And it is of a mother and son who are lying side by side. Eventually, they did it. At first, they didn't realize it was a mother and son until they were able to do some DNA testing. And they realized that they were related and that by their ages, they assumed they were mother and son. So the son was buried with his ankles crossed and his knees bent outward. Like imagine if you're sitting on a floor and you kind of put your feet together and let your knees splay outward. That's kind of how his knees look. And then his neck had been broken and his head was twisted at a little bit of a weird angle. And this all leads archaeologists to believe that he'd been tied up and hanged before he was buried. I'm not sure, though, why they would have left his legs splayed unless he kind of froze that way.
They may have buried him sitting up.
Oh, yeah.
That is
true.
Apparently fairly common. And it's just a thought.
Yeah, that's a good thought. So that was the son. And the mother's skeleton was she was laying out flat, but she was weighed down by 3 large stones. And she was also buried with a spear or a staff or something like that. It could have been the staff of Osiris.
Seems likely.
And this could also explain why she was weighed down by the stones. And maybe they weighed her down because they were afraid she might come back, because the Vikings had a tremendous fear of people coming back to haunt them after death.
Yes, they did.
They had some very elaborate rituals and things that they did to prevent that. And we'll talk about that in October, which will be fun to talk about some of the beliefs of what happens after death and zombie-like creatures and all kinds of those creepy things. And then, we're asked, why were they buried together? Why were they, did she die of natural causes and then they killed him because he, as a sacrifice? There was a theory that maybe he had a disability of some sort and couldn't survive without his mother, and they maybe killed him. But that one doesn't explain to me why he was hanged and tied up.
Yeah, that's very far-fetched.
Yeah. I mean, he must have done something that if it was just a sacrifice, you think they would have just like used a knife or a sacrificial sword or something and not tied him up and hanged him. That's like a criminal's death.
Yeah, there are other sagas. The Laxdala saga talks about a whole family of sorcerers, and they're all killed. But, it's a family thing. It's like a family business. It is. So.
Right. Oh, yeah. And it's not unusual for these Viking graves to have more than one person in them. There was one, I think it was it Repton, England, where it was like a man, and then I think they discovered he was his son, and they'd both been killed in battle, and they were buried in the same grave side by side. That was
very recently.
Yeah. So there could be a story in a saga that sheds some light on this particular burial in Denmark. So this saga is and please forgive me if I butcher this name, the Eyrbyggja saga.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. It's one of the Icelandic sagas. So it might seem strange that, a burial in Denmark and an Icelandic saga are related, but, these Vikings, they got around and their stories got around. So it's not entirely impossible or even improbable. So this was written down in the 13th century, and I think it could shed some light on the burial in Denmark. So like many of the Icelandic sagas, this one has a large host of characters. And many of them are named Thor something, Thorstein, Thorbjorg, and it can get Thorfinn. It can get kind of confusing. Who's who did what to who, and I'm not going to go over that. It was mostly feuding over land and livestock, which is often what a lot of these family dramas in the Icelandic sagas are about. So, but the story of this mother and son, Katla and Odd, involves horse theft and a group of men acting like vigilantes to solve a problem. So at one point, it's kind of complicated, but at one point, one man's mother's hand is cut off, and these men try to figure out who did the deed. And then all fingers point to Odd. Oh, no pun intended again. I didn't even think about it till I said it out loud. Oh, goodness. I'm full of it today. Okay. So this posse travels to Odd's mother's house, where they find her sitting on a dais, on a platform, spinning yarn on her distaff. So right away, I'm thinking she's on a platform, she's spinning, there's some magic involved.
Yeah.
So Katla knows who these men are and that they're coming, and she knows they're after Odd. So she cloaks him with magic so the men can't see him. She tells her women who are spinning with her to just sit there and be quiet, and she's going to do all the talking. The men burst in and they demand that she give them Odd, but she just innocently tells them, oh, Odd's not here. You're perfectly welcome to look around, search everywhere. She even has one of her women give the men the key to the only locked door in the house. And so she just freely says, please look around my house. My son is not here. They basically ransack the house. They find no trace of Odd, so they leave. But they don't get far before Arnkel, the leader and the smartest of the bunch, I think he's a priest. There's a little bit of a push and pull in this particular saga between the pagan ways and the Christian ways. So I think Arnkel is a priest. And once they get a certain distance away, he wonders if Katla hasn't performed some kind of magic. And then he thinks, what if that distaff that was in her hand was really her son, Odd? Because that's probable.
Yeah. He must have been skinny.
Right. So these men head back to Katla's house. She knows again that they're coming, and she tells Odd to go outside and get down on his hands and knees. So when the men return, they find Katla out front of her house, stroking the hair and beard of a goat. Once again, they ransack her place, don't find Odd. Then they look for her distaff, which she has blatantly left sitting on a bench. And it's just a distaff. No Odd. So they head out again. And once they get a certain distance from the house, Arnkel says, hey, what if that goat was Odd?
So I guess they had to get a certain ways away so her magic didn't influence them anymore.
I think so. It had to have been. Yes. So they head back to Katla's house. And in the meantime, she tells Odd to get under the rubbish heap.
Oh.
So, and actually, the rubbish heap was like a really important thing for archaeologists. They find out a lot about old, medieval
their
towns.
Diet.
And their diet, if they had like parasites and stuff. Anyway, so a rubbish heap is not an unusual thing to have, outside your house. So Katla tells Odd to go get under the rubbish heap. So this time when the men show up, she's back at her dais spinning. She's got her distaff in her hand, and now she gives them a hard time when they burst in. And she's like, man, these visits are just coming hard and fast now. Like, what is with you guys? She once again agrees to let them search the house. All they see is the pig on the rubbish heap, which they ignore. So once again, they walk away, only to realize that they've been tricked. The pig was Odd.
The oddest pig I've ever seen.
Right? But this time, though, things are changed. They're met by Gyrid, one of the men's mother, and she also knows magic. She's a very practiced sorceress, I guess. She knows what she's doing. And Katla knows that she can't trick this other sorceress like she has the men. So she simply hides Odd under the floor beneath her seat on the dais. So it's interesting that the storyteller in this saga made a note. Like, it's not really what they're wearing isn't really described until we get to Gyrid, and she's wearing a blue cloak, which is reminiscent of the blue cloak that Thorbjorg was wearing in Eric the Red saga. So maybe that was meant to signify or symbolize her ability to do magic. I don't know, but I thought it was interesting that he purposely mentioned the blue cloak. Anyway.
There are some other sagas that talk about it too, and I'm going to have to go back and look at them because they're not always magic. Sometimes they mean that they're out for blood, and I don't remember which one. I'll have to research that one.
Interesting.
Very
okay.
Interesting.
So this time when they all go back to Katla's house, there's no words exchanged. She doesn't say anything. The men don't. Geirrid bursts in the door and throws back her cloak, puts a sealskin bag over Katla's head and ties it around her neck.
Oh,
yeah. And I wasn't sure, did she do that because maybe there was something about Katla's eyes? Like if she saw them, she could perform the magic. Something about covering up. Oops, it just hit my mic. Something about covering up her face was important.
There's something like that in the Laxdala saga too, when Kotkel's family, one of his sons, they tie a bag over his head, and that's so that and there's a tear in the bag and he can see, and that was a threat. So yes, them not being able to see is a thing, but I'm not sure what.
Almost like the evil eye or something.
Yeah.
I mean, I could see them also maybe putting something over her mouth so she couldn't say anything too, but they don't. They just she covers up her head and ties it around her neck. Geirrid knows immediately that Odd is under the floorboards, so they break it open and they find Odd. They bind poor Odd and drag him to a place where they hang him. So while Odd was at his end, poor guy, he's probably kicking and screaming, Arnkel berated him and says, it's your mother's fault that you've come to this sticky end, Odd.
Of course.
She's wicked and evil. And then Katla, she's not willing to let Arnkel have the last word. So she speaks up and admits that, she's the one who cut off that woman's hand, and she is the cause of all of this. And she curses Arnkel that he'll suffer more from being his father's son than Odd ever suffered from being her son. Well, I guess that's the last. Yeah. I love that she got the last word in and she cursed him.
Yeah.
So, of course, the men can't have this. They take her away and they stone her to death, which is sad. But I thought it was kind of fun that in, very fairy tale fashion, the men go to her house 3 times and she tricks them 3 times. And it reminded me of, is it Gunleg, the witch in Norse mythology, that the Aesir gods try to burn her 3 times and 3 times she escapes.
It's Gulvig.
Gulvig. Right.
Gold lust. Gold,
yes, that's right.
Gulvig.
That was close.
Yes.
Yeah. It reminded me of that a little bit.
The magic of 3s, like you said before.
Yeah. The magic works 3 times. So anyway, so, nobody knows for sure if this story was inspired by the burial of the mother and son in the Gerdrupt grave, but, it certainly has a lot of similarities, and it can certainly shed some light on maybe what had happened and why this mother and son were buried together. Maybe they did think she was a sorceress of some kind and killed, maybe he had something to do with it and they killed them both and put the rocks on her so she couldn't come back.
It's quite a coincidence if it's not the case.
Yeah. And I think it's a neat story also to show how the magic worked, how they believed the magic worked. And it had to be
probably one of our best examples.
Yeah. And how it had to be, they had to be in the vicinity of Katla or her house, and then once they got a certain distance, the magic wasn't working anymore. They threw the bag over her head. It's an interesting story.
It's very interesting. Well, there's several burial grounds, usually near marketplaces, where we find a lot of possible sorceresses buried. One of them is Kaupang, which is in Vestfold. There's actually several of them, and the word means marketplace or trading port. But there's one in Vestfold, Norway, which was very busy, and it was overseen by the hall at Skiringsal. And they've actually excavated that hall as well as this market area, which was teeming with people, and it's surrounded by cemeteries. It's also very close to the Oseberg burial ship, and I'll get into that in this discussion too. But anyway, the port was surrounded by cemeteries. And in his book, The Viking Way, which I highly recommend, the archaeologist Neil Price describes an especially complex boat burial. And there are actually illustrations of these burials in his book too that I really strongly recommend. So in this one particular one, a man in the mid to late 9th century, which is when Skiering Saw was really at its most active, he was buried laying on his left side, and he was pressed up against a large stone. He wore a cloak, and he was covered with a fine cloth, a finely woven cloth, and he was surrounded by tools. So he was somebody of status, because you don't get buried that way unless you're of a fairly high status. So then maybe 50 years later, another burial was placed right on top of him. A boat that was about 30 feet in length was laid on top of this man's grave, and it was aligned with his body. And 3 people were buried in this boat. A man and a woman lay in the bow, and they were head to head. So the man was the farthest forward, and his feet pointed towards the prow. And the woman was, the woman was forwardmost, and her feet were pointing towards the prow, and the man was behind her. So this woman was aged around 40 to 50 years old, and she was very expensively dressed. And oddly enough, an infant lay wrapped in her skirt. She was probably too old to give birth. So this may have been her grandchild, possibly. But she was surrounded by female grave goods, including jewelry and a weaving sword. So the man is buried just aft of her. So he's almost amidships, and his feet are pointing towards the stern. So the two of them are head to head. And they don't talk about how old he was, but he was surrounded by weapons. But oddly enough, a frying pan was placed on his midriff, like his solar plexus. And also 2 spindle whorls had been laid carefully on his sword scabbard. And what that means is really hard to say.
Did he do magic?
Yeah, I don't know. And of course, no idea of how they died either. So then there was a horse amidship, just after these 2 people. He was wearing a bridle, the horse was wearing a bridle, and there were other animals scattered all throughout the grave, as if they were sacrificed over the grave, which is a pretty common thing with ship burials. In the stern, a single woman was buried, and she was sitting up, leaning against a shield, or there was a shield behind her. So it looked like, that was her backrest. And being buried sitting up is a pretty common motif. It's possible that she was holding the tiller and steering the ship.
Oh, I love that visual.
Yes. They don't know for sure because it's all disintegrated, but that is the suspicion very strongly. On her lap was, again, an imported bronze bowl from the Middle East, and runes were scratched on it that said, "in the hand basin." And inside the hand basin, the bowl, there was a dog's head. And this dog's body was at her feet. On her left was an iron staff, and there was a big rock on the staff. So it bears an awful lot of similarities to the burial you just talked about, where the stones were placed on the woman. But there's others that are like that. But while we're in the vicinity of Oseberg, we've talked about the Oseberg ship burial before. So it was in the early to mid 9th century, and it's a burial of 2 women on a ship. There were many animals sacrificed in this grave too. I believe there were 13 horses.
Wow.
As well as dogs and many other animals, birds. It also includes, though, this Oseberg tapestry, which I think I mentioned before. And this is one of the only pictures we have of life during this time period. So in one picture on this tapestry, there's a tree that has what looks like 9 men hanging from it, while women bearing swords and with their arms raised, they're walking under the tree, and it looks like they might be performing some kind of a ritual. There's other places on the tapestries, and I think we talked about this with the Shield Maiden, where there's women who are armed with shields, sometimes spears, and they're wearing costumes. It looks like wearing a boar costume or a bird costume. There's also men in animal costumes. So this all talks about magical rituals. Of course, there is the one story about the Uppsala temple where they had a tree where they hung men every 9 years. So that's actually a historical record. Anyway, so that seems to be what this is depicting. There's also an iron lamp in the grave, and there's a woman bearing an iron lamp in the tapestry, and she seems to be leading at least part of the procession. There's a pouch containing cannabis seeds that really sounds an awful lot like those henbane seeds. Mm-hmm. And there's also the grave had been robbed in the 10th century, maybe 100 years after, but there was one chest that had not been opened, and inside there was a wooden staff. There was no metal staff found, but this was a wooden staff, and it was a piece of wood that had been split, like a branch that had been split. Then it had been bound back together, and it had been laboriously planed and carved and polished. So they're thinking this might be a magic wand, and there might be more there may have been more of them, but they just didn't last. They disintegrated, whereas the metal staffs did survive.
I wonder if the grave robbers didn't disturb that because they knew what was in there. And they knew better than to get those staffs out of the box.
Because in a lot of these magical sorceress burials, there are these wooden chests that have magical implements in them. There's a lot of commonalities, and I'll mention a lot of them. So the other one is, in the Oseberg ship, they found, in addition to this tapestry, they found an elaborately carved wagon or cart that I've mentioned before. And there are carts on the tapestry being driven. We can't tell if they're by men or women, but it kind of looks like might be a woman driving them. And we don't know what's inside these carts because they have covers over them. But there are there's some conjecture that there were the figures of the gods and goddesses like Freya and Freyr were in those carts, possibly. Throughout Scandinavia, in addition to ship burials, wagon burials seem to be associated particularly with high status women. So you're talking about the one in Firkat, but there are others. Another thing about wagons is the Roman historian Tacitus is writing in his writing Germania. He wrote of a sacred procession in which the goddess Nerthus rode in a wagon. So there's thoughts that this could be part of that ritual, but we have no idea. We really don't. We also have, in Volsunga Saga, we've got Brunhild, who rides to hell in a wagon.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So, it's a form of transportation to hell. Nobody knows about, these are just associations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but when you get enough of those associations, when you have things in the stories and the mythology and the archaeology, and they all kind of piece, and you get writings from people who are looking at this from the outside, you can kind of piece together some neat stories.
Yes, you can. It's so fascinating. So there is a woman who was buried in Hordaland, Norway, in a place called Veka, and her burial was in the 10th century sometime. And she was buried in a large wooden box that may have been a wagon bed, like the sorceress that you talked about. And she was buried on a rise overlooking a fjord. Her box was buried under dirt, and then a stone cairn was laid over that. And her burial contained brooches, bead necklaces, a coin from King Offa's reign, which is quite a bit before this, quite a bit before the 10th century. So it was kind of an heirloom of some
Mm.
kind. And then she had other sewing and personal items, a sickle, and there was a chest in this. She lay on her side, and she had an iron staff held between her knees, which is very odd. There's so many different things that you can draw from that, but it kind of reminds you a little bit of a witch riding on a broomstick.
Mm.
So I don't know, but there's other things, there's other connotations you can draw
Sure.
from that. But the main thing is that she was buried in what maybe it was a wagon bed.
Mm. With a box.
Yep, it was a wooden box, and there's several of those. So on the east coast of Norway, in Rogaland, which is the fjord area, and it's near Stavanger, there's a place called Gausel, which I believe I've mentioned before. And it's now a suburb of Stavanger, but it lies on an inland fjord. And there are many high status women's graves. I think we talked about this before in our one of our earlier ones. Here, the high status women's graves outnumber men's 2-1.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's the only place in Norway that's like that. The area also has the highest concentration of Irish metalwork in Scandinavia. So the Gausel Cemetery is very high status. It has a number of boat burials. None of the bones have survived, so the graves were assigned sex based only on grave goods.
Mm.
So, whether there were weapons or blacksmith tools, those are men, supposedly. Don't know that for sure. But the Gausel Queen's grave was designated as female due to the jewelry and the household equipment that were with her. And her grave was probably the most wealthy of all the graves. There was a bridled, severed head of a horse that lay at her feet, and there was a highly corroded iron staff and also an iron lamp similar to the one in the Oseberg burial and on the Oseberg tapestry. The grave and its location implied very high status and possibly the ownership of inherited property. So then we go to Birka, Sweden, and there's a huge cemetery there with a lot of high status graves. So Birka in the Viking Age was a major trading port, especially with the East. And so and that's where BJ 581, the burial that turned out to be a woman commander that we talked about earlier, that's where this was found. But there are quite a few graves here that contain staffs and other items that suggest they're the graves of Valur. I'll just list them. These are all from Neil Price's Viking Way. So there's BJ 660. It's the wealthy grave of a woman that contains an iron staff with a bronze knob. And the bronze knob is something that was mentioned in Eric the Red saga. This woman wore a silk headband embroidered with silver thread, and she had brooches, the twin brooches, and a necklace with a cross, which is kind of odd, but it could have been loot. You never know. And we don't know for sure what a cross meant to them.
Right.
Another grave is a cremation grave, but it just contained an iron staff. There's a famous one called BJ 834, where a man and a woman were interred together. The man was apparently seated on a chair. The chair is not there anymore, but he was seated on something. And the woman was on his lap, and they were chained together to the chair.
Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. And behind them was a staff that was leaning against the grave wall next to a sword. So it was a couple. And there were crampons, which were sometimes referred to as hell shoes. So we don't know about that. They were also used on ice, to walk on ice. There were 2 horses buried with them. And the most interesting thing about it was a spear was cast over the grave as if they were being dedicated to Odin.
Very interesting, because Odin is also the god who is often associated with both warfare and magic. And he was the only male god that we know of who actually performed Sather, the that more female type of magic. So that's a super fascinating grave.
It really is. It really is. And
Why were they chained together? Huh.
Yeah. So, and maybe they were even executed this way.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
There's no sign of how they died, or that's not known at this point. But she probably was a vulva.
Mm-hmm. And the staff and the sword, very evocative. Interesting.
Right next to each other. Mm-hmm. In this book, The Viking Way, there is an illustration of this grave, and it's as well as quite a few others. BJ 845 is a chamber grave, and it's under a mound, and a woman was buried sitting in a chair. Again, the chair is missing, but she was sitting on something, and she was facing east. She wore a silk headband embroidered with silver thread, just like the woman in BJ 660, and an iron staff was across her knees. And this grave also contained an empty iron box that was highly ornamented. Another thing that shows up in some of these graves are pig jawbones. Very odd. Well, we know that pigs were sacred to Freya and that they were a favored meal of the Vikings. But something about these burials seemed to suggest sorcery. BJ 959 is the grave of a woman who had been decapitated. Her head was under her right arm, and a pig's jawbone was placed across her severed neck.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was somebody really thought about that before.
Some kind of ceremony.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
And what
her head is under her
right arm. And so this might have something to do with being able to walk, because there's stories about decapitating a draugr, so that was the only way to kill them. I don't know. My guess is that decapitating her may have been to keep her from walking.
Yeah.
I don't know. But there are other graves. There are 3 cremation graves in Birka, BJ 84, 86, and 210. And they also, even though they were cremation graves, after the cremation, pig jawbones were placed over the cremation. So the pig jawbones were not burned. They were just laid on top of the ashes. So,
oh my gosh, my mind is spinning trying to figure out what does that mean?
It's so interesting.
It's so specific. It's not just like, here's an animal's jawbone that we will throw over here to do whatever. It's a pig's jawbone.
And they were definitely laid in the grave after the cremation had taken place. So, this is Frey and Freya, both were associated with pigs.
Yeah.
And of course, they were associated with magic and Sefer. So I don't know. Anyway, It's all very, very interesting. So then it's also in Sweden. We've got a grave in Klinta, which is on Åland, which is an island. And a man and a woman were cremated together in a boat, and they were lying on a bearskin. There were animals sacrificed, and it is suggested that these animals were all the ones that were present on the farm. So that reminds us of the dish of hearts that Thorbjorg ate in Eric the Red's saga. So even though it's far away, it's still that ritual of all the animals on the farm. And after this couple was cremated, their ashes, this is very involved, but their ashes were separated, washed, and then they were buried separately. So some of the ashes did get mixed up, but apparently it was pretty obvious that they had been re-separated.
Weird.
Yes. So the woman her ashes were buried in a pit, and an iron staff was laid across it, like her vulva one.
Wow.
And the staff had a model of a building, a house or a temple on the top of it. It's kind of crude, but it's definitely a building.
Was it made out of metal?
Yes, it was iron.
Okay.
And yes, the building was also made of iron.
Interesting.
Yeah. That's very, very odd, but it seems that there were charms that were possibly hung from the staffs, because some of them have perforations and rings on them where charms can be. So they might have waved them over people, for example, to heal them. And
maybe they shook them to like get the spirit's attention or something.
Exactly. And that's something that was in Neil Price's book. It goes on at length, and I won't get too far into this, but he did a lot of examination of the Sami sorcery. And the idea is that a lot of the Norse sorcery came from the Sami or vice versa. And they did that. They did have wands, and they did wave them over sick people to try to heal them.
Okay.
Anyway, I don't want to go too far into that because it gets, this could go on for a long time. So here's another Gotlandic burial. It's a place called Aska, and it's in Östergötland. It's a rich burial of a woman, and it contained an Arab bronze jug. Also an ornate horse harness, an iron staff, a silver pendant of a man's head, and another one, this one's pretty famous. It's a pendant of a woman wearing a triple strand necklace, and her hands are folded across what looks like a pregnant belly. And she appears to be seated on a platform, a Sather platform, perhaps. So there's some conjecture that this could be the goddess Freya. And that would be in keeping with this burial, because it definitely looks like the burial of a vulva.
I wonder if there's some significance to these bronze bowls that have come from Asia.
Yeah. Well, there's the one that has the dog's head in it, but they must have, or it could be for catching the blood. They talk about when they sacrifice animals, they catch the blood in a bowl, and then they use the first branches to sprinkle people.
I guess I always kind of assumed that those bowls would be made out of like something else, like stone, or
they would have been, but if they imported some,
I guess if they were high status, that would be something to fascinating.
Exactly. As you mentioned, you talked about Katla and her son, and then you also talk about the burial where the mother and son were buried together. That could be what this story is based on. So there were male Sather practitioners. Odin is the most famous of them. But these men did not seem to be regarded with the same respect as females. Their burials and representations in the saga suggest something shameful. And the word for that is ergi, and it also has homosexual connotations. In the Lokasena, Loki calls Odin's practice of Sather perverted. So this all brings up the subject of gender roles and gender fluidity, especially regarding magic, because there were definitely laws later on about cross-dressing. It was against the law in Christian Iceland, for sure, because it's written in the law books. But there's a figurine that was found of a figure being someone dressed in women's clothing and sitting on a throne. But that figure is one-eyed, and that figure is flanked by ravens and wolves. And it's strongly suggested that this is Odin, who's practicing Sather. But he's dressing.
Yeah, I was just looking at a picture of that figurine. Actually, I still have it on my computer. And what I think was kind of interesting is that the cap that the figure is wearing, and then there's no braids. Like often these figures of Valkyries or women or whatever, they often have, even the one I was talking about earlier, she has a long braid in the back, or they have, or a long ponytail almost, or they have braids that come down. But this one has nothing. This one looks more like a man, honestly, or and the cap is kind of unusual.
And he's kind of burly.
Yeah, kind of wide. Yeah. But you can see that there's some kind of two animals on the back. there's two birds on the arms of the throne, but it's very clearly a woman's dress. And then there's the beaded necklaces, but it's such a fascinating little find. It's only like a few millimeters tall, and it's super tiny, but it's so fascinating. I think it's Odin, even though I know a lot of people are like, oh, it's Freya. And I'm like,
no,
it doesn't look like any representation of women that we typically see in these little figurines.
And the missing eye is generally taken to be Odin.
Right.
However, there are some sources that talk about Frey and Freya sitting in Odin's throne, but sometimes all together. But on the other hand, this, the missing eye really makes you think of Odin. So I don't know. It's tantalizing.
It really is.
Oh, and then also there's the last thing about male practitioners. Harold Fairhair hated male practitioners of Seidr. His wizard son, who was of a Finnish mother or a Sami mother, his son was a wizard and he had a big following. And Harold Fairhair had him and his following all put to death by chaining them so that the tide would come over them, drown them.
Brutal.
It is. It's pretty awful. But anyway, That was how they looked at male practitioners. It was considered unnatural.
I just, you going through all of those burials, there were so many staffs, so many simple similarities between these women. I love the ones where there's a woman and a man buried together. But yeah, I mean, it's just, and then you put that with the saga of Eric the Red and what she was wearing and what she had on her person and her staff and everything. Yeah, they had to have been sorceresses. Yeah.
Yes, it's very intriguing and tantalizing, and there's so many pieces to put together in the puzzle.
Yeah. And then there's like runes written on things and, carved in things.
Well, another thing that was very interesting is that it was when Scandinavia Christianized and outlawed magic that women lost their status. So it seems that women's status really relied upon magic, and that was what they were able to use for power. It was their only power. And once they lost that, they became subjugated.
Yeah, that's an interesting thesis. That makes a lot of sense.
And they were persecuted, of course, throughout Europe. That's when they became labeled as witches. And certainly the men still believed in witchcraft. But
even like what we saw with Gunhilda, they believed she was doing witchcraft.
Absolutely.
Only it wasn't allowed for her when it was allowed for Egil.
Right. Well, and even in the in the Renaissance period, witchcraft was still very pervasive and very much believed in.
I was just that mention of Egil is interesting because he's considered like some big Icelandic hero, right? He's like this ultimate Viking man. He's like this ultimate Viking guy, and yet he performed magic.
Yeah, well, so did Odin.
Yeah, so it's interesting that Egil would be held in such high regard, even though he did magic.
Yep.
So yeah. I guess humans then and now are just not consistent. There's always outliers, and maybe because he was such a brute and so physically imposing that they just kind of said, you can do what you want. We're all scared of you.
As well, they should be.
Yeah, they should be. He killed his first person when he was 7. So, okay. That was a lot of information about these archaeological finds. And thank you for going through that Neil Price book and finding some of this stuff.
That really great. I've always been fascinated with those.
I think in another life, if I could go back and be 20, I'd maybe study archaeology. Too late for that now, but now I can just read about it. Look at pictures. Next time we will be discussing the Norse undead. The Norse dread of the undead. They were so terrified of the undead.
They believed in werewolves, and they believed in, Walking Dead. So some of the stories that have come down in the ages actually originated, in ancient Scandinavian times.
Yeah. So that'll be fun. That will be our October Halloween.
Absolutely.
Fun dive into the undead and all that goes bump in the night. And believe me, they were scared of those bumps. But and in typical Viking fashion, they did not mess around with our undead. They were horrifying.
Yes.
They weren't timid.
That's true. And the cure for them was horrifying
yes.
too. I mean, there are several where they have an actual battle with the undead.
All right. Well, thank you. And I will see you next time.
Yep. Next time.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, K.S., at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.